What are you doing with a gun in space? This is the No Fear cast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa, and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 4, episode 25. It's the summer, and normally we like to relax a little bit with our format. In past summers, we've indulged in some lighter fare like classic sci fi and blockbusters. This summer, we are following that trend with some 70s disaster movies. But Matt and Mel made me watch The Swarm, which absolutely killed my desire for any more 70s disasters. So I made them skip ahead to the future to enjoy a little 90s disaster films. And we're starting with Armageddon. Mel, I'm going to throw this one to you. I'm trying to decide if my choice to move to the 90s was better than staying in the 70s. But I guess I'll start with your thoughts on our Armageddon rewatch.
Sure. I guess I'll just talk just a little bit about the film in general and then my kind of thoughts about it. So when Armageddon came out in 1998, and this is a movie that was directed by Michael Bay. It was produced by a few people, one of which was Jerry Bruckheimer, who is also kind of tied to other disaster movies of the 90s. I think Michael Bay and Jerry Bruckheimer are also tied to movies with a lot of action, particularly Michael Bay's style for a lot of explosions. Interestingly enough, I noticed that there were a lot of people who worked on this screenplay, but the two people who were credited included J.J. Abrams, which I thought was interesting looking back on this. And I think it was one of the top grossing films of the year. And like the other disaster films, if I'm remembering correctly, some of the music, the sound, the visuals, that sort of thing, did get some Oscar noms, but this movie also had some Razzie nominations as well, which I think Bruce Willis won one for it. So it's kind of a mixed bag. When Armageddon came out, I actually did not watch it in the theater. I rented it from, I believe, a Blockbuster, maybe a movie gallery. I don't know. It was the 90s, and watched it, I think, with my sister, if I'm remembering correctly. So I didn't have that kind of experience of seeing it on a big screen. I saw it on a television screen, but rewatching it now was kind of weird. One of the articles that you threw in the doc for us to look at, Lisa, was a BuzzFeed piece from a couple years ago called "How Armageddon Became the Ultimate Disaster Movie in More Ways Than One." And a lot of the points that the writer that she made in this article, I realized I had been thinking during it. So like I said before we started recording, one of the things that popped in my head while I was watching is, wow, this was just a long extended Aerosmith music video. Another thing I thought of is, wow, this is like a long extended like political commercial kind of for America. I mean, the two shuttles are independence and freedom. And I just started laughing at one point for all the weird angles and shots they were doing to have sharp or blurry American flags behind people when they were talking about things that really had no need for that to be happening. But I think one of the things the writer mentioned that kind of struck me is that it's, when you think about the 90s, we really weren't probably as, well, what's the word I'm looking for? We weren't as accepting that Armageddon and the end of the world could happen at any moment. And so it's kind of like this weird safe place that gets like turned upside down, the apocalypse, to the point where toward the end of the movie, I actually thought that something had messed up with my Amazon. I was watching a 50s movie because all the kids were dressed in 50s clothes and using like weird, those cars with like no motor or whatever. And like the signs were all for like 50s and 60s politicians. Oh, sorry, Matt, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say the soapbox things.
The soapbox racers. Yeah, to like, I guess, throw us back to like a better time or something. So at the World Trade, the towers were up, though there was this really disturbing scene where the meteors had hit them. And I was like, whoa, it's almost like you're seeing like the future there in a really creepy way. But yeah, people talk about, oh, Saddam Hussein is blowing us up. Like everything they were talking about and all their concerns were so much different. And I thought it was interesting that the article is like, you know, it's hard to scare us now because we're scared all the time. And this woman was writing in 2018. And I'm like, here we are watching Armageddon in 2020. And I had no idea when I was watching this film, obviously in 1998, having, um, basically like getting ready to, or basically, let's see, 98. I was out of high school at that time, but just out. And I'm not thinking about like pandemics and all the sorts of stuff we're worrying about now. So I know, Lisa, you had mentioned in the doc that you still got some anxiety from it, and I could totally see that I did too. Even though the science makes no sense and the whole plot is laughable because it doesn't really make a lot of sense, it still keeps you like it's so much action and cuts that you're just like, whoa, like eye candy, as opposed to some of the movies that we watched where we kind of got bored. Um, but so I feel like, yeah, it has some stress and anxiety that maybe the other disaster films didn't have. But like watching it in 2020 is just kind of this weird, like, look back at a different time. Um, so yeah, that's probably a lot of word vomit, but those were some of my first impressions. I don't know. What'd you guys think on your rewatch?
Well, I would like to just say that I thought this movie was glorious. It was amazing. It was, and I say that, and I'm being a little bit facetious here, but not completely, because there's a lot of schlock to it. Like you said, it's basically. I would not have been surprised if at the end it turned out that this was not just an Aerosmith video, but a commercial to join the Marines or something. Like it really felt like a pro America. Uh, I don't even know what you call it, extended commercial or something. And I was also kind of, I'd forgotten the strange, weird Midwest nostalgia where, like you said, there's people sitting in like old pickup trucks listening to the radio, and kids in overalls that are barefoot playing with radio flyers. And I mean, it's this weird, like it's 1998, but for some reason the Midwest is still the 50s. But I think you're right. Like watching this now is a really weird thing. I mean, I grew up in the 90s, and I mean that was I was born in the 80s, but the 90s was when I really was coming into my own, I guess you could say, as a person. And it's a very different place than it is now. And I guess I hadn't realized what watching a movie like this is in a post 9/11 world. And I mean, I realize 9/11 is almost 20 years ago at this point now, but I would say that that was kind of the big turning point for a lot of things. And it's been so long that I've forgotten kind of how optimistic and everything that the 90s were. But all that aside, I mean, the movie is it's it's schlocky and it's crazy and it's over the top, and there's absolutely no reason I should love it as much as I do, but it is. I love it. Like it's terrible, but I love the movie. It's the same way that I feel about The Rock. It's not a good movie, but it's a good movie. If that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. It was fun to watch. It was fun for me to watch it and kind of have these weird memories, flashbacks of when I watched it before, and fun to watch it now. So yeah, I totally see that.
But yeah, it's definitely. I mean, the whole movie kind of like feels like an assault on sanity, because like from like minute 3 you're like, what? you like well, I'm not counting the prologue where they talk about the death of the dinosaurs. That was a nice little history lesson, but I mean, but yeah, really it's just like I spent so much time watching this movie going, what? But I still loved it. So I shouldn't have, but I did. So I'll let Lisa chime in if she wants to.
Yeah. I mean, look, I stand behind my decision to move us out of the 70s. I agree with everything y'all have said. This was a super fun movie. It was fun to revisit because I definitely have memories of watching this in the movie theater and enjoying it, and I still enjoy it. And it's funny because you can tell how much the disaster movie has grown in those like 2 decades. Because one of the things that we learned watching all the 70s disaster movies is that a lot of times the disasters were really small in comparison, and they didn't happen until sometimes 3/4 of the way through the film. And this one was completely the opposite. And I was like, well, this is what I guess in my head, I had always associated a disaster film with, like, just by default, it's like Armageddon, because that was the one I remember watching in the theater. And this one does start big. I mean, number one, I had completely forgotten about the dinosaur prologue, which reads like a bad student paper. They might as well just, well, they did say since the beginning of time, practically, which is kind of laughable. But even if you took that little like prologue off, like the thing starts big. It already tells you, okay, there's a meteor or an asteroid or whatever they called it heading, like, hurtling towards Earth, and it's going to kill everybody and everything, and not even leave bacteria. And then they immediately put a ticking clock on it. So at some point they're like, okay, we've only got 15 days to figure this thing out, or it's going to be too late. So even though, like, looking back on it after I've now watched it, the plot is laughable, because I still don't understand why they didn't just train the astronauts to drill rather than training oil drillers to be astronauts, because that seems way harder. But anyway, we won't talk about that. But they start with the big, like, oh no, I mean, you can't have higher stakes than the entire world is going to die, right? So they start big, and then they immediately flip you over to, like, the main people you're going to be following, and they're having this, like, oil emergency on this rig or whatever. So it's like it hits you right away with two pretty big emergencies from the very beginning. 3 if you count the dinosaurs dying, but I don't, because I still think that's a ridiculous way to start a movie. But yeah, it was effective in raising the stakes, and it was effective in keeping my attention. And one thing I was not prepared for, I was prepared for the extended Aerosmith video, because I remembered a lot of that. I remember the song. I can't hear that song now without thinking of this movie. I remember Ben Affleck and Liv Tyler making out a lot in the movie, and they did in the most uncomfortable of places, by the way. Like, on top of space station parts and stuff. I was just like, that can't be comfortable. But and I guess it added to the rock feel of the movie. But there was a lot. Okay, there was a lot of one-liners in this film. Okay, we started with this episode off with one of them. What are you doing with a gun in space? But there were other ones like, your boyfriend's back. I mean, just there were so many, like, one-liners that were meant to be like zingy dialogue that it was almost exhausting. And the number, I don't know if y'all counted. I lost count at one point, but the number of montages that this movie has, like, it's crazy, especially as they were assembling the, like, driller to astronaut team. Like, these are the guys who are going to, like, save Earth. And they did the whole montage of, like, going to find the guys. And then they did the whole montage of them, like, doing medical exams. Then they did the whole montage of them training to be astronauts. And that, I'm pretty sure there was a montage of them walking slowly in their space suits at some point.
That was interrupted by a rendition of Leaving on a Jet Plane.
Yes, it was. And I felt exhausted at one point, because I was like, between these one-liners and montages, like, when are we going to actually see movie? Because it was a lot. It was, I don't know, that must be very specific to the 90s, because I don't remember this in any of the 70s horror movies, 70s disaster movies at all.
Yeah, they definitely had, like, multiple training montages, and that was something I was not prepared for, because I saw this in the theater when it came out, and I may have seen it again on, like, basic cable or something one afternoon, but it's been a long time since I've seen this movie. And I know I mentioned this to both of you before we started recording, but even while watching it, I watched it with my family, because our youngest had not ever seen this, and we thought, oh, well, we'll subject him to this. And I remember at one point looking at my wife and saying, it takes them a really long time to get to space. This is like a 2-hour movie, and they don't get into space until at least an hour in. And yeah, I mean, there were a lot of it felt a little like they could have cut some of the fat off, I guess. It should have been a tight 90 minutes, and instead it was a full solid 2 hours, and some of that was unnecessary to me. But I do love the montage of them like reassembling the band that literally just broke up. Like, they leave the oil rig, they bring in Bruce Willis, and then he's like, okay, well, we got to get my band back together. They've been on shore leave for like 8 hours, and they've spread to the winds, So I did enjoy that montage. So, but yeah, it seems built for the one-liners and the zingy dialogue. I totally agree with that.
I didn't understand the logistics of that either, because they just take Bruce Willis away in a helicopter and tell him the world is going to end. And yeah, all these people are like spread out across America or something. It really didn't make any sense. But yeah, I mean, it did have kind of a comical montage going on. Yeah, I mean, this movie is like 2.5 hours of people saying one-liners at each other and changing scenes. I agree with you that they could have cut a little bit off, but that's something we've kind of complained about with all the disaster movies, is just the huge cast of characters that sometimes get short shrift in some spots, and trying to fit too much, like just bloat kind of the movie itself. It seems like something that's repeating in our conversations.
And I'll be honest, some of these characters, I mean, obviously Bruce Willis, Ben Affleck, they're the main focal point here. And even William Fichtner, who's such a beloved character actor that I actually know his name, not just that guy, but he would be the pilot / head of the astronauts. But some of the rest of Harry's crew some of them feel fairly developed. Like I felt like I knew all I needed to know about Michael Clark Duncan's character and Steve Buscemi's character. But some of the other ones, it felt like they, like you said, like we've got this huge cast and we've got to give them all backstories and we've got to really make you feel something when they die. And so they were trying to give them backstories that felt a little forced, like when what's his name? William Patton, I think. Chick, when he goes to visit his ex-wife and their kid who doesn't even know who he is, and like, who's that? Oh, he's just a salesman. Like, I get it. He's estranged from his wife. He hasn't seen his kid, but it just felt a little forced, if I'm being honest, especially when they're watching the rocket take off and she's like, that's not a salesman. He's your daddy. Like, oh my God. Just,
yeah.
Just, I need insulin to combat all of this sugar that you're forcing down my throat. So
I also didn't get how he was conveniently near enough to see them. Like, that was kind of strange, because he has like one night to do whatever he wants, and he just happens to be in the same town basically as them.
Well, Mel, if you follow out the implications, he's a stalker, and that's why she has a restraining order. But we can't follow these implications because the movie doesn't allow us, because it's already cut like 5 times by the time we have that thought. So
that's true. I like Chick, but his backstory seemed forced. But yeah, there were 2. So Owen Wilson's character, and I don't even know who the other guy was, the random last guy. They died pretty
Max,
quickly.
the driller. Yeah.
And I didn't even really care, because I didn't know them well enough I was like, oh, they killed the least known people. Everybody else is okay.
Let me tell you a funny story about this movie. When I watched it this time, Owen Wilson walked on the screen, and I go, oh, I forgot Owen Wilson was in this movie. And then when you just said his name again, the thought came back in my head, oh, I forgot Owen Wilson was in this movie.
Yeah, his character makes such a huge impact on
and it's weird, because most of these disaster movies in the past, at least one of the characters who has died has been a character that they've like let you follow, a little bit, enough that it really kind of hurts when they, when something happens to them. I mean, certainly the earliest ones we watched, the Poseidon Adventure and the Towering Inferno, both kind of followed that model. And with this one, the characters who did die, I felt like were the ones that were the least developed and were the ones we had the least stakes in. And so that felt like a weird departure. The characters that they did, even if those were kind of, like you said, Matt, I agree, kind of saccharine sweet stories, backstories like Chicks, at least we knew enough about them and we had stakes in those personal characters' lives. And so we wanted to see them live. I'm just saying it was a weird choice that they didn't develop any of the ones that died. They just kind of felt like, oh, well, they were here too, and we had to have somebody die. So might as well be them.
I mean, they almost felt kind of like the stereotypical Star Trek red shirts. They were brought on to die.
Right. They did. Yeah.
I've actually, as a bit of a side note, because this global pandemic is stressful, I've been going back and rewatching Star Trek: The Next Generation because it's a nice utopian idealistic future. And I just recently watched an episode where the entire episode everyone was mourning the death of someone who you had never seen before, except for the 5 minutes that she was alive on camera in this episode. So that's kind of how I feel about some of these characters. It's like, oh, we're supposed to mourn them because they're part of the crew, but I don't really know anything about them. Like, Owen Wilson's character was kind of weird and spacey. Like, okay. And I know Max the Driller got a tattoo that his mom liked because she was there getting the tattoo with him. Like, that's all I could tell you about his character. That's all I know.
And the third guy died. I don't even remember his name or him saying much of anything other than agreeing with people. I knew more about and cared more about the character that was supposed to be from Russia than I did the three driller guys.
Since you mentioned him, the Russian is one of my favorite characters in this movie because he is so insane. I love him. I love him so much. I'm sorry.
He had some pretty good zingy one-liners too.
Well, like it. And I know we're jumping way to the end, but at the end when they're trying to take off and they can't take off, and he's like, no, like Russian, American, they're all parts are built in China, and just starts beating on it, and it makes the engine start. I'm like, yes, of course. The crazy Russian hits something with a wrench, and it saves them. Like, I love that.
Yeah. Well, I did like that. That was fun. He was a good character. And even though we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, and Steve Buscemi's character right now, like watching it now feels a little teeth gritty because they're constantly making jokes about him sleeping with underage women. And that feels weird. But at the same time, I just want to say I want Steve Buscemi in everything.
Steve Buscemi is hands down my favorite part of the movie Con Air. And I know that sounds like a tangent, but his, and we were talking about this before we started recording. I'd say there's there's a split to his character. There's the first half of the movie before they go to space where it is very cringy, where like all the jokes about him are about how he's oversexed and sleeps with underage women. And then that just falls away and he gets the space dementia and is insane and really funny. So I don't know. Like it's a hard to reconcile kind of thing, but I do love Steve Buscemi. Like, he gave it his all. I think some of the actors, I mean, you could kind of tell this, like Bruce Willis likes a paycheck and that's why he's in this movie. And Steve Buscemi's like, you know what? Paycheck or not, I'm going to 10 on this. And you could tell he was having fun.
That is what I like in disaster movies, and I think that's what I missed in The Swarm. Was The Swarm didn't have any like fun about it. You know what I mean? Like a disaster movie, you go to see things. I mean, you go to see things blow up. You go to like live through a little bit of like false anxiety, but you also want to have kind of fun with it. And this movie was a lot of fun. And yeah, even for all its faults, and I think it does owe a lot to some of the characters that they wrote in that were obviously there to have laughs, like the Russian astronaut or Steve Buscemi's character. Yeah, I liked it. One thing that really surprised me and kind of shocked me too is the optimism in a lot of this movie, and you guys were kind of calling it. I guess it was like a kind of go America where freedom lives forever type of theme throughout the movie. And I just remember, a lot of the '90s is kind of having this reputation as being so cynical. Um, but then there was that line, and it kind of like hit me now in 2020 watching this, where Harry is talking with Truman, and it's when he's first like telling him about this this plan that they have to like train oil drillers to go up to space and land on this asteroid and like drill into it so they can plant bombs, which is laughable now that I'm saying it out loud. And Harry says something like, well, you've got to have a backup plan, right? And Truman was like, no, we don't have a backup plan. And I actually looked up the quote later because it just had me rolling. This is what Harry says to him. He says, and this is the best that the government, the US government can come up with. I mean, you're NASA, for crying out loud. You put a man on the moon. You're geniuses. And then he kind of keeps going. He's like, don't tell me that like you don't have a backup plan and that we're the world's hope, basically. And I just like started laughing because I was like, did we really in the '90s have that much faith in the US government? Because now, I'm like, well, yeah, coming up with a ridiculous plan to save the world. Yeah, that's kind of on par.
Well, I mean,
But
this was also the height of the X-Files, so 1998.
Mhm. That's true.
So I mean, you kind of have both sides of things, but
I get, yeah, that's
Well,
true. I don't know. It was very optimistic. It was very optimistic towards like, what NASA could do, what the government could do, but maybe it was just that, like you said, that kind of pro, marine commercial that this kind of was. But
well, it's
it was,
funny that you
I found
mentioned
that
that.
funny.
Well, I mean, I find it funny that you're mentioning this because just today, in fact, our youngest asked us what it was like in the 90s, and I was trying to describe it to him, and I was like, well, it was like a more optimistic time because it actually kind of was in a lot of ways, at least compared to 2020. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there is a lot of the cynicism of Gen X and grunge music and everything like that. But um, I don't know. I mean, it's that. Yeah, it was kind of a weird mix. Like the cynicism was there, but we also kind of, I think, underneath it had a little bit of hope. Like we're cynical and jaded, but we kind of hope for the best. Whereas now we're like cynical and jaded and nihilistic underneath. So
That might be it. It was cynicism mixed with hope. Maybe the perfect way to describe like the mood of the '90s.
yeah, not to sugarcoat the 90s. There was a lot that there was still racial injustice and race riots even in the 90s after the Rodney King verdict and other things of that sort. But I don't know, I guess the overall mood of the country was a bit more hopeful than now, where it's like, oh God, just get us through the next month, not even the next year, the next month.
Yeah. I do think though what you guys were talking about, the cynicism versus hope, there was a lot of hope and like, we're America, we can kick this problem. I mean, they don't even try to work with other countries because they have their shuttles, independence and freedom.
Well, they
But
kind of do. Like they give lip service to the idea of working with the other countries, like
that's true.
getting the fuel from the Russian space station. But I mean, let's be honest, it really is a pro-America rally. Sorry, I
But
didn't mean to cut you off there.
oh no, that's fine. I did think it was interesting that the cynicism and terrible things that the government can do snuck back into this movie, because we have this manufactured conflict where people are screaming at each other for no reason, kind of similar to the swarm again, because we discover when things start going a little bad, as they would, this is your only plan. It's really stupid to put all your eggs in this basket. And of course, things start going wrong because they've never done this before. The government has basically this glass case that the astronaut breaks to get out a gun in space, which how that's going to work out. I don't know how things were on fire in space or shooting in space. I didn't get that. Or how they could walk around the asteroid just fine, unless they couldn't because they needed to fly away. But yeah, basically the government had this whole secret plan where if things start going wrong, don't trust the oil drillers. They don't know what they're doing. Break the glass, get the gun, shoot them if you have to, kill all of them. And we'll remotely blow up this bomb and kill all y'all. And that's going to help us, even though they claim that it has to be 800 feet down or pieces are so big will hit the earth and kill people. Somehow, if it's 800 feet down, it'll make the rocks go either side of the earth. And while I was watching it this time, I was totally thrown off by this cognitive dissonance, because I was like, why is this? Well, I thought it was, I appreciate the fact that Bruce Willis actually kept asking, why is this happening? Because it made no sense. It was like, we're all optimistic. America, heck yeah, we're sending these oil drillers. They're our only hope. Billy Bob Thornton loves them. Meanwhile, this general and the president have talked about how if things start to go a little south, you just kill them all and blow them up. And then somehow Willie Sharp is brought over to the oil drillers position within 30 seconds or something. And then they got to choose the red or blue wire. And so I thought that was kind of, I mean, it didn't make a lot of sense and it was done kind of strangely. But if you're thinking of like, we had this whole movie going up to like, we can do this, this is amazing, to we had a secret plan to take you out the whole time because we thought you were too dumb to do it, and now you are. And it didn't work smoothly. It felt like two separate movies. It was like everybody got an evil side from the mirror universe all of a sudden. But it was a way to create conflict, I guess, and make Steve Buscemi lose his mind. So yeah, I don't know. I felt like there were moments where this kind of, the people in charge don't have your best interest at heart all the time, snuck into this movie too.
No, you're right. I totally glossed over and had even slightly forgotten about that part, but it was a pretty big plot point. So no, thanks for mentioning that, because you're right. The generals did have their secret underhanded second plan, which was just to blow up the nuke on the surface, which, yeah, for all the movie logic, wouldn't have worked. Why would they have even had that backup plan? But whatever. so yeah, I guess there was kind of the optimism of the American spirit, but you still can't trust the people in charge. I don't know.
Yeah, and they didn't fully explain it either. But I felt that tension there.
Yes, Mel, that was the one plot point that was never fully explained in this movie. Everything else was very sound and well-reasoned. So.
Everything else made perfect sense. Even Charlton Heston's student paper at the beginning. It was all sensical.
Well, one part of the movie that we haven't mentioned in all of our talking, and this is one of the things that I remembered from like teenage Lisa watching this movie in the theater. And now, even now, like watching all the 70s movies, and knowing we were going to watch Armageddon and kind of thinking about it, this was the first real disaster movie that we've watched in the series. And the other ones have had love aspects, but this is the first one that is like part disaster film, part love story, kind of like in a similar time period to this one, like Titanic, where it's on one hand, you know, Jack and Rose's love story, and then it's also about the disaster of the Titanic. This is very much about Liv Tyler and Ben Affleck and all of their romantic interludes to Aerosmith music throughout this movie. But this was, I feel like this was one of the things that really marks like 90s disaster movies, is the idea that, you know, in the 70s, it was some love aspect. There were people who were in love, but it was usually multiple couples that you were following, and that wasn't a major part of it. But in this one, it was always just one love story that you were like really invested in. But watching it now, I just found that whole, I don't know, it felt strange to me because it even ends, the movie ends on a montage because it ends on the wedding montage, right? So it's like their story, their happy ending, I guess. It just, guys, it felt weird to me. Like, half the time where Liv Tyler was in scenes, I kept thinking, why is she here? Like, why was she in the NASA room watching with everybody? Why was she getting to hear about like she'd be in there, like the generals are talking to their now like astronaut trainees, and she's like, oh, well, there's Liv Tyler. I'm like, why is she here so much? I don't know. It just felt very weird. So I was curious. I don't know. I want to throw that out there. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
And she had no purpose in the movie other than to tell her future husband and father to come back, to promise to come back to her, basically.
Yes.
Well, I mean, that really was her purpose, wasn't it? I mean, I was going to say something snarky about them letting all the other girlfriends and wives come in, especially before they leave. But no, it's really just her and Ben Affleck and leaving on a jet plane. But I mean, Lisa, they did explain her presence with the line of dialogue by saying that she has nowhere else to go. So
I forgot
about that.
Like, they literally, like, that's literally it. They're just like, well, she has nowhere else to, like, really? She doesn't have a home? Well, I guess not. She lives on an oil rigs, but like they don't have an apartment somewhere where they keep all their stuff. I don't know. It was
they spent a lot of the movie talking about like how she was raised with all these men, how they practically like raised her, and her father, makes this big deal about like, I don't want you to be with men like this, and I want something better for you. But I don't know. And then I kept looking at her, I was like, okay, well, she's an adult. I mean, they're talking about her getting married. She gets married at the end of the movie. And, her father makes that like very, I guess that's his sad, like, I wish I could walk my baby girl down the aisle, and like giving her his blessing like that, right before he dies, which was very sweet. Like, I'm not saying that wasn't a sweet relationship, but I just kept thinking like, she's a grown woman. Like, why? Yeah, she has nowhere else to go. I don't know. That is when you kind of unpack that line too, it is very uncomfortable because this was what, 98? And you talked about the Midwest scenes feeling like the 1950s. Like, that feels like, we're throwing it back to like the 1850s there. Like, well, she's watching her boyfriend and her father go up in space. She has nowhere else to go. We better watch her.
Well, and even when Bruce Willis's character decides that he's going to sacrifice himself instead of Ben Affleck's character, I guess I should call them Harry and AJ, but it's easier to forget their names. It ends up, it's becoming like an exchange of her. It's like, well, I was a great father, but it's important for her to have you as a husband. You take care of her. Literally, it's like a passing of her on because, she has nowhere to go.
It was completely like, I remember watching this in the theater and thinking how romantic it was that like the father, sacrifices himself so that like he recognizes their true love kind of thing. And I remember being like, oh, my little stupid teenage brain was like, oh, that's so sweet. It's this great love story. And then watching it now, I'm just going like, dear Lord, they're passing her like property.
Yep.
Yeah, I had similar thoughts watching it. I mean, I don't know what the anti-Bechdel test is, but this movie passed it. Like, there are no women talking to women, and the women there are only there to serve as plot points for the men. Like, it's the opposite of the Bechdel test.
It is.
I mean, it's everything that she was writing about, going, dear God. But,
yeah. And then the death scene of Bruce Willis when she learns that I couldn't help but giggle. I guess I remembered that he died, because I remembered that plot point. But the way they do it is like, I guess his face is like on every screen in NASA's room, and then it all just goes to static, and you just see her hand like up on one of the screens. And I was like, I guess that's the grieving hand. Like, that's I don't know. I just found it. I was like, well, this is very much the Aerosmith music video kind of style we were talking about. But out of all the death scenes in the movie, it was a funny one, I thought.
I do find it interesting that they had just spent the previous 30 minutes of the movie having constant communication problems with Earth, but now it's a perfectly crystal clear while he's giving his I'm going to sacrifice myself speech. That seemed really convenient if you
yeah. Yes.
And also, I do, before we move away from Liv Tyler, and we can keep talking about her character, I think there's a lot to unpack too, but I do just want to say, if we do start moving to another topic, that, I mean, how really weirdly creepy is it that it's her father who wrote the song that is playing while she's having her love scene with Ben Affleck? Like, that right there is like some Oedipus Rex level creepy.
I thought the same thing, and especially because I think it was in that scene where she was talking about how she didn't have anything else, and she was talking about how much she loved her father, and I thought, I have a really hard time just buying the fact that Liv Tyler is Bruce Willis's daughter, because to my mind, they don't look alike at all. And Liv Tyler looks so much like her real father, that whenever I look at her, I see Aerosmith. And because we were hearing Aerosmith the entire movie, like, I had a hard time separating that anyway when we were, while we were watching. And there were times where I was just like, this is a little strange to have you getting all hot and heavy and your dad's voice playing over it.
Like, I remember thinking it the first time I saw it, and every time I've seen it since, that like if my dad wrote a song when I was anywhere near anything romantically inclined, like holding hands with a girlfriend, nope, not that song. Like, definitely not what they're doing. Like, that's just like not even in the realm of possibility for me. But
and again, and I know I'm harping on this a lot, but like, they obviously were trying to make Ben Affleck and Liv Tyler like this great romance, and they kept having them get romantic in the most uncomfortable of places. Like, the first time we see them sleeping together, they are literally on an oil rig that is exploding. And
in that tiny, cramped little room, yeah.
In a tiny, cramped little room. And that was my first thought, is I was like, oh, like, I don't know, maybe my teenage self thought it was, cool, but like my nearly 40-year-old self was like, my back would never recover from that. And then, when we see them later, like, and Bruce Willis like spies on them. This is when, like, the turning point in the movie, when he realizes, I guess, that Ben Affleck like really cares about her, and that's gonna set up what happens later when they're on the asteroid. But when he sees them and they're like in the, I don't know, was it the booster of the rocket ship? The
Something
big
like
round
that.
part, something. I don't know
Girders
the name
were
of
involved.
this.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. But again, they're literally on a metallic round surface. And I'm like, could you not find somewhere more comfortable to like have your little sexy time than a piece of a spaceship? Like, I guess, I don't know. I guess it made for a good visual. But again, then her fake father was spying on her. So that was creepy too.
But they had nowhere else to go.
I don't buy it. There are hotels around.
Right? I mean, if this is a NASA facility, there's, yeah.
I mean, I was guessing like they were in the South. They were probably in Florida, right? I mean,
for the launch, at least they should.
For the launch, they were, yeah. So either that or Alabama. I mean, look, they're
possibly Houston, because that's where a lot of NASA stuff is based out of.
Right. I mean, yeah, you're gonna find hotels. I promise you can go find something on the cheap, much more comfortable than whatever they were doing. Yeah.
Well, we're starting to get kind of short on time. I don't want this to feel too abrupt, but I did want to ask Lisa, how does this movie fare against your disaster movie rules?
All right. Well, I will say this. They do well for the ticking clock. And they do well for the sense of peril. And even though they didn't really put kids or lovable elderly people in danger, they kind of did because it was the whole world. So I guess that was part of it. They didn't have anybody saying, don't look down or I can't do this, which was a little disappointing. And we've already established that, you know, Liv Tyler's character was only there to deliver the line, promise me you'll be back. Like that was in her character bio, I'm pretty sure, in the script. It was just, you know, whatever her character's name was, and then Bruce Willis's daughter, you know, promise me you'll be back. So, you know, it did there. We had a little bit of the two groups, but it was very tiny again. Because Mel, you know, you mentioned the kind of generals who had the secondary plan to blow it up. So there was that, but it was downplayed quite a bit. There was the sacrificial death. That has been a big theme. So it did fit that. I mean, and that was what I remembered was Bruce Willis being willing to die so that his daughter could have the big love. But again, the other ones who died, like there were other deaths, but usually I had noticed that it followed certain rules. So my rules were there was going to be the guy who didn't listen and who dies because of that. There's going to be the one that everybody loved, and then the one who almost makes it. But in this, the other deaths didn't really fit into that because we didn't care about them enough. So yeah, I don't think it fit other than the sacrificial death. You know, so yeah, it fared pretty well. As far as, you know, the ticking clock, the promise me you'll be back, the sacrificial death. Yeah, it did pretty well. I mean, I'm just glad we're watching something better than The Swarm. So at this point, I'm ready to give this a grade of an A++.
Well, don't go crazy.
Look, you know, I've got a low bar after watching The Swarm. Y'all did something to my brain with that one.
Oh, and see, that's how I felt after Cassandra Crossing, if I'm being honest here. Like that one. The Swarm felt redeemable in its badness, and the Cassandra Crossing just felt like, God, no.
Yeah, I agree.
The Swarm had Michael Caine, and we can all agree that he elevates everything that he's in. So,
Well,
and Olivia de Havilland too. So
it's true. All right. Well, I still stand by my grade of giving Armageddon an A++, even though it is an extended Aerosmith video and Liv Tyler's character makes no sense in the movie. And yeah, the plot is pretty nonsensical as well. But my review of it is A++. It's not The Swarm, and that makes me happy. So I'll leave it with that. Well, what I would love also is for our listeners to tell us what they think of Armageddon, because I'm pretty sure all of you out there have memories of this film, or maybe you've watched it recently. And so we'd love to hear that. So drop us a note. We're on social media at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. If you'd like to contact us by email, we do have an email address, nofearcast@gmail.com. Don't forget it's KNOW. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to exclusive content. So right now we're releasing these main episodes every 2 weeks, but in the off weeks that we are not releasing an episode, we have exclusive episodes that our Patreon supporters get to hear. So if you'd like more No Fear Cast, you can support us there and get some extra bonus episodes. If you cannot do that right now, if that's not feasible, we completely understand, because these times are difficult. You might want to consider telling a friend, or rate and review us on whatever app you are listening to this podcast on. Every time that you rate and review us, it helps other listeners find us. So it really helps our podcast. It helps get our name out there, but it's also free for you guys. So it's kind of a win-win. With that, I'll just say thanks for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.